Forget everything you think you know about this ceasefire. Forget the carefully worded official statements coming out of Riyadh. Forget the optimistic background briefings that Washington has been feeding to friendly journalists for the past 3 weeks. And forget the breathless network coverage assuring you day after day that the parties are converging toward a historic agreement that will bring stability to a region that has been burning for decades. What happened in the last 72 hours is not a diplomatic stumble. It is not a temporary breakdown in an otherwise viable process, and it is not a negotiating tactic designed to extract last-minute concessions. What happened is the complete and calculated dismantling of a framework that was never, under any realistic reading of Iranian strategic doctrine, going to survive contact with the actual decision-makers in Tehran. And the genuine tragedy of this moment is that some of the people who built this framework understood that before they ever launched it publicly into the diplomatic arena, they designed it anyway. That tells you something important about the gap between what official policy is designed to accomplish and what it is actually intended to achieve. Let me be absolutely clear about something the State Department is desperately hoping you will not have the analytical background to understand. Iran did not reject this ceasefire because of clumsy wording or because a particular phrase landed badly in translation. Iran did not reject it because of a miscommunication that a more skilled diplomatic team or a more patient negotiating process might have prevented. Iran rejected it because the framework, as written and as intended by its architects, would have required Iran to surrender every meaningful strategic advantage that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has spent 40 years constructing, sustaining, and defending at extraordinary cost, in blood, in treasure, and in the diplomatic isolation that the Islamic Republic has absorbed for decades, rather than compromise its strategic position. No government in Tehran, regardless of which faction holds nominal executive power at any given moment, regardless of whether the person signing the documents calls himself a moderate or a hardliner, was ever going to accept that trade. The framework was designed around a misunderstanding of Iranian strategic requirements, so fundamental that it raises serious and uncomfortable questions about whether the people who put it together were confused or whether they were serving a different agenda entirely. I spent years in military intelligence. I have been in rooms where decisions like this one get made, and I mean the actual rooms, not the press conference stages that are set up for cameras and visiting dignitaries, not the comfortable briefing theaters where politicians receive carefully sanitized summaries designed to protect their existing assumptions, but the working rooms where men who have spent their careers studying adversary doctrine sit in front of maps and signals intelligence and tell you with quiet, hard-won precision what the other side is going to do rather than what anyone hopes they will do. And I am telling you right now, drawing on every year of that accumulated experience, that the analysts who designed this ceasefire framework either did not understand Iranian strategic doctrine at the level the task required, or they understood it perfectly well and designed something they knew would fail because failure served someone's purpose. I have watched this pattern play out more times than I care to count. Both possibilities are damning. Both possibilities should disturb anyone who takes seriously the question of whether American strategic policy in this region is being conducted competently and honestly. Stay with me carefully here because what I'm about to walk you through changes everything you think you understand about where this conflict is heading. The proposal that Saudi Arabia put forward, with explicit American endorsement and considerable quiet pressure from European partners who are watching their maritime shipping costs and their energy import budgets spiral in ways their domestic populations had not yet fully absorbed, resting on three structural pillars. The first was a mutual cessation of Houthi missile and drone operations against commercial shipping in the Red Sea corridor, including container vessels, bulk carriers, energy tankers, liquefied natural gas carriers, and the full range of commercial traffic on which the functioning of the global trading system depends. The second was a verified freeze on IRG sea-linked weapons transfers into Yemen, with monitoring overseen by a joint body involving the Arab League and the United Nations, with on-the-ground inspection access to suspected delivery routes, storage facilities, and maintenance installations. The third was a 90-day confidence-building period leading to broader negotiations on Iranian regional influence simultaneously across Yemen, Iraq, and Lebanon, with the implicit assumption that progress in Yemen would generate momentum for harder conversations about the totality of Iranian strategic positioning. On paper, to someone who has never seriously studied how Iran conceptualizes regional power projection, this might look like a reasonable foundation. The problem is that on paper is the only place that reading holds up. Let me walk you through the technical reality, because the technical details are where the truth lives, and where mainstream analysis continues to fail the people who are genuinely trying to understand what is happening. The Houthi ballistic missile and drone campaign against Red Sea shipping is not, as American officials insist in their press briefings, a discrete and containable conflict that can be resolved in isolation from the broader regional strategic situation. The Houthi ballistic missile capability currently in operational use, specifically the Badr-1P solid propellant ballistic missiles with their 800-kilometer operational range and 485-kilogram separating warhead, and the Tufan anti-ship cruise missile variants positively identified through wreckage analysis from unsuccessful intercept attempts by U.S. Navy vessels in the southern Red Sea. These are not independent Houthi weapons that Iran resupplies through a charitable military assistance arrangement. They are functional nodes in a network deterrence architecture that spans from southern Lebanon through Syria, through Shia militia networks embedded in Iraqi security structures, and down the full length of the Arabian Peninsula into Yemen. The FAT 360 precision rocket artillery systems with 120-kilometer range and GPS-aided terminal guidance, pre-positioned in western Yemeni governorates to hold Saudi desalination complexes and oil infrastructure at continuous risk. The Qatar anti-ship cruise missiles with 300-kilometer sea-skimming engagement range, positioned to dominate the Bab el-Mandeb Strait at its narrowest navigable point of approximately 26 nautical miles. The Shahed 136 loitering munitions with 2,000-kilometer range, stockpiled in dispersed, hardened underground sites throughout northern Yemeni governorates. These are Iranian strategic assets operated by Houthi personnel within an Iranian command and control architecture, serving Iranian strategic purposes that extend far beyond the Yemen conflict itself. Asking Iran to freeze their transfer is asking Iran to voluntarily dismantle a component of its core national defense architecture. Before we go any further, I need you to understand how Iranian military doctrine actually functions at the doctrinal level, because without this foundation, the rejection makes no strategic sense, and you will remain vulnerable to the comfortable but fundamentally wrong interpretations that official sources will push. Iranian military doctrine, codified in what serious analysts call the mosaic defense concept, is built on a single non-negotiable principle that Tehran has maintained with remarkable consistency regardless of external pressure or decades of international isolation. No single point in the system can be made decisive against Iran by any adversary, including the United States. The architecture is specifically engineered so that destroying any one component, degrading any one proxy network, eliminating any one country's capacity, does not reduce the total system's deterrence function below an acceptable threshold. This is precisely why Iranian military planners were not fundamentally alarmed when Israeli strikes degraded portions of Hezbollah's rocket inventory in Lebanon. The architecture was designed to absorb that kind of targeted degradation and continue functioning at an operationally acceptable level. When the Lebanese node takes damage, the Yemeni node maintains pressure on maritime choke points, creating economic leverage. When the Iraqi node faces pressure, Syrian logistics pathways reroute essential supply lines. The redundancy is not historical accident. It is the foundational design principle of the entire system. If Iran accepts a weapons freeze in Yemen while American and Israeli pressure continues simultaneously against Lebanon and Iraq, the Mosaic defense concept degrades below the minimum threshold Iranian planners consider acceptable for deterring direct military action against Iranian territory itself. The entire architecture risks systemic failure at precisely the moment Iran can least afford a degraded deterrence posture. The rejection communication delivered through back-channel contacts to Saudi intelligence before it was communicated through official diplomatic language made this calculation explicitly and in terms that left no room for alternative interpretation by anyone reading it with the proper analytical framework. The rejection was not emotional. It was not ideological posturing for domestic Iranian audiences who needed to see their government stand firm against Western pressure. It was not the irrational behavior that Western commentators default to when Iran does something they cannot explain through the lens of their own strategic assumptions. It was a precise strategic calculation delivered in the language of operational military doctrine by people who understand exactly what they are doing and who have thought through the second and third order consequences more carefully than their counterparts in Washington and Riyadh apparently managed to do before launching this initiative. What I have not yet told you is what Iran actually demanded in return, and this is where the situation moves from regionally alarming to genuinely dangerous for the broader international order. Iranian counterproposals included three demands the Saudi side recognized immediately as non-starters: a complete cessation of American arms transfers to Israel, specifically the GBU-31 Joint Direct Attack Munitions and AIM-120 Advanced Medium-Range Air-to-Air Missiles sustaining Israeli strike tempo, a formal written American commitment preventing Israeli strikes against Iranian-aligned forces in Syria, verified through Russian military observers at Hmeimim Air Base, requiring Washington to legitimize Russian military presence in Syria as an international verification authority, and a phased drawdown of American naval assets tied explicitly to independent monitoring of Israeli settlement activity. These were not opening bids. They were demands crafted to be rejected. When a sophisticated state actor makes demands designed to be rejected, the message is unmistakable. Keep watching, because the next part is where this becomes dangerous, not just for the region, but for the entire structure of international order that every government in the world depends on. When a sophisticated actor makes demands specifically structured to ensure rejection, they are communicating clearly that the conflict environment as it currently exists serves their strategic interests better than any diplomatic resolution the other side can currently offer. And Iranian planners have correctly assessed several compounding facts. American carrier strike groups in the region are operationally constrained in their freedom of maneuver in ways that have not been seen in decades, forced to operate with combat air patrol patterns that reflect the anti-ship missile threat environment rather than projecting power freely as American doctrine assumes. Global shipping companies are absorbing multiple billions of dollars monthly in Cape of Good Hope rerouting costs that compound indefinitely and generate political pressure in consuming economies that ultimately translates into pressure on American and Israeli policy. Israeli military capacity is stretched across simultaneous operational fronts in ways not seen in a generation. Political pressure on Saudi Arabia and European governments to find resolution intensifies with every passing month in ways that structurally favor a patient Iranian cost imposition strategy over any timeline the other side can comfortably sustain. Iran has looked at this picture with cold strategic clarity and concluded they are winning the current situation. A ceasefire on terms the other side can accept would interrupt a situation Iran is winning. Iran has no rational incentive to accept it. The strategic interpretation that Washington is offering publicly, that this is simply a case of Iran overplaying its hand and that patience and sustained pressure will eventually produce a more compliant Iranian position, represents precisely the kind of comfortable but dangerously incorrect analysis that has led American policy in this region to fail repeatedly over the past 3 decades. Iranian leadership is not overplaying its hand. Iranian leadership is playing a different game than the one Washington is describing. One with different winning conditions, different timelines, and different definitions of acceptable cost. The Iranian government has demonstrated across 4 decades and under 6 different American administrations that it is capable of absorbing extraordinary levels of economic pressure, international isolation, and periodic military exchange without changing its fundamental strategic commitments. The analysts and officials who keep predicting that the next round of sanctions, the next military demonstration, the next diplomatic framework will finally produce the Iranian capitulation that previous rounds failed to achieve are not learning from the evidence in front of them. That is a serious analytical failure with serious real-world consequences. There is also a dimension to this ceasefire collapse that the coverage is almost entirely missing, and it is the dimension that matters most for understanding what comes next. The collapse does not simply leave the situation where it was before the negotiations began. It actively degrades the credibility of Saudi Arabia as a regional diplomatic actor in ways that have immediate consequences for Saudi domestic politics and for the willingness of other regional actors to follow Saudi diplomatic leadership on subsequent initiatives. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman invested substantial personal political capital in this framework. The public collapse, with the terms of the Iranian rejection becoming visible through the diplomatic back channels that serve as the region's actual information infrastructure, represents a significant blow to the narrative that Saudi Arabia has been building domestically around Vision 2030 and around the Crown Prince's claim to be delivering a new era of regional stability and economic normalization. Managing that domestic political damage while simultaneously managing the military and economic pressure from Houthi operations is going to consume Saudi political bandwidth that was supposed to be focused on the economic diversification agenda. The ripple effects from this single ceasefire failure extend into Saudi domestic politics in ways that further complicate an already difficult strategic picture. What I have watched throughout my career and what I am watching now with familiar and deeply uncomfortable recognition is the moment when a conflict dynamic develops its own internal logic that begins to override the preferences of the individual actors who theoretically control it. Each of the parties to this situation, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the United States, Israel, the Houthi movement, each of them believes that they retain meaningful control over whether this escalates or stabilizes. Each of them is conducting their own cost-benefit calculations based on their own assumptions about what the other parties will accept and what they will not. And the history of this region, the history that I have watched unfold from positions that gave me access to the calculations being made on all sides, is that those assumptions routinely fail to account for how the other side is actually thinking. The gaps between those assumptions are where wars begin. The gaps between those assumptions are where we are right now. I wish I could offer something more reassuring. I take no pleasure in this analysis. I have been wrong before in my career. I acknowledge that freely. And I may be wrong about aspects of this assessment as events continue to develop in ways none of us can fully anticipate. But I have watched this pattern play out for long enough, in enough different contexts, to tell you with confidence that the optimists in this conversation are not seeing what the evidence actually shows. The collapse of this framework does not return us to the pre-negotiation baseline. The dynamics have shifted in ways that are not easily reversible. The Houthis now carry explicit authorization to escalate operational tempo, not as a bargaining chip to be used in future talks, but as a sustained strategic signal that the resistance axis will not be contained through diplomatic frameworks it did not help design and that do not account for its core interests. The missile resupply operations that continued throughout the entire negotiation period deliberately suppressed from public reporting because disclosure would have destroyed the political rationale for the talks themselves have increased Houthi operational capacity to levels measurably above where this crisis began. The Badr 1P inventory in Yemen today is larger than it was 6 months ago. The Shahed 136 stockpile is larger. The anti-ship missile coverage of the Bab el-Mandeb is denser and more capable. That is not a ceasefire failure. That is strategic preparation conducted in broad daylight by an adversary who has correctly concluded that their current approach is producing measurable and compounding results. The secondary and tertiary consequences of this ceasefire collapse extend well beyond the immediate military situation in Yemen, and they deserve serious attention from anyone trying to understand where the next 6 to 12 months are heading. The Bab el-Mandeb choke point, through which approximately 12% of global trade transited before this crisis began, now faces an indefinite, sustained interdiction campaign with no diplomatic resolution pathway currently visible on any horizon. The Lloyd's of London war risk insurance premiums for vessels attempting the Red Sea transit have reached levels not seen since the peak of the 1980s tanker wars, making routine commercial shipping through the corridor economically unviable for many operators and deeply costly for all of them. The economic pressure this generates registers in inflation data across Europe and Asia in ways that compound with every passing week, creating political pressure on consuming governments that will eventually force policy responses that none of the governments involved currently want to make. The global shipping industry has already begun the process of restructuring its route planning and its insurance arrangements around the assumption that Red Sea transit will remain disrupted for an extended period, and that structural adjustment itself creates path dependencies that will outlast any eventual diplomatic resolution. The world is reorganizing around this disruption. That reorganization has costs that will be paid for years. The decisions being made right now in this hour in closed rooms in Riyadh and Tehran and Washington and in military command centers whose names will not appear in any press release or official statement will determine whether this moment becomes a turning point toward some form of managed de-escalation or the opening chapter of something significantly larger, more destructive, and far harder to stop once its full momentum has been established and its logic has taken hold of the situation. What happens in the coming days will echo for years. I have spent enough of my career watching this region, watching these actors, watching these dynamics, to understand with uncomfortable clarity how thin the margin between those two outcomes actually is. Right now, in this specific moment, that margin is thinner than at any point I can remember across a long career of watching the Middle East push itself toward and sometimes over the edge. The clock is running, and it is running faster than most people realize. The window for a different outcome, for a framework that actually accounts for what the parties to this conflict actually need, rather than what we wish they would accept, is not standing open indefinitely. And the people in the rooms where these decisions are being made need to understand that before the window closes entirely. Let me leave you with this. The mainstream coverage of this ceasefire collapse will spend the next several news cycles focused on who is to blame, on the optics of the failure, on the domestic political consequences for the leaders involved, and on what the next diplomatic initiative might look like. All of that coverage will miss the point. The point is not that this specific framework failed. The point is that any framework that does not begin from an honest accounting of what Iran actually requires for its own security, rather than what we wish Iran would be willing to accept, is going to fail in the same way for the same reasons. The conflict will not end because one side runs out of weapons or runs out of money. It will not end because international pressure finally produces the strategic capitulation that previous pressure cycles failed to achieve. It will end, if it ends, when the parties involved find a framework that addresses the actual security requirements of all the actors, including the ones whose security requirements we find inconvenient or illegitimate. That is a harder conversation than the one currently happening in any official channel I am aware of. It is the only conversation that can actually lead somewhere different from where we have been heading. The next 72 hours matter. But what matters more is whether anyone in a position of genuine authority is willing to have the harder conversation that the events of the last 72 hours have made unavoidable for anyone paying honest attention.